Part the First, Chapter 5 of Dick Sands, the Boy Captain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit dlibrivox.org. Recording by Alex C. Tillander, Davis, California. Dick Sands, the Boy Captain, by Jules Verne. Translated by Ellen E. Frewer. Part the First, Chapter 5. Dingo's Sagacity. Meantime the "Pilgrim" pursued her course, keeping as much as possible to the east, and before evening closed in the whole of the Waldeck was out of sight. Captain Hull still continued to feel uneasy about the constant prevalence of calms. Not that for himself he cared much about the delay of a week or two in a voyage from New Zealand to Valparaiso, but he was disappointed at the prolonged inconvenience it caused to his lady passenger. Mrs. Weldon, however, submitted to the detention very philosophically, and did not utter a word of complaint. The captain's next care was to improvise sleeping accommodation for Tom and his 4 associates. No room for them could possibly be found in the crew's quarters, so that their berths had to be arranged under the forecastle, and as long as the weather continued fine, there was no reason why the negroes, accustomed as they were to a somewhat rough life, should not find themselves sufficiently comfortable. After this incident of the discovery of the wreck, life on board the "Pilgrim" relapsed into its ordinary routine. With the wind invariably in the same direction, the sails required very little shifting. But whenever it happened, as occasionally it would, that there was any tacking to be done, the good-natured negroes were ever ready to lend a helping hand, and the rigging would creak again under the weight of Hercules, a great strapping fellow, 6 feet high, who seemed almost to require ropes of extra strength made for his special use. Hercules became at once a great favourite with little Jack, and when the giant lifted him like a doll in his stalwart arms, the child fairly shrieked with delight. "Higher, higher, very high," Jack would say sometimes. "There you are then, Master Jack," Hercules would reply as he raised him aloft. "Am I heavy?" asked the child. "As heavy as a feather." "Then lift me higher still," cried Jack, "as high as ever you can reach." And Hercules, with the child's 2 feet supported on his huge palm, would walk above the deck with him like an acrobat, Jack all the time endeavouring, with vain efforts, to make him feel his weight. Besides Dick Sands and Hercules, Jack admitted a third friend to his companionship. This was Dingo. The dog, unsociable as he had been on board the Waldeck, seemed to have found society more congenial to his tastes, and being one of those animals that are fond of children, he allowed Jack to do with him almost anything he pleased. The child, however, never thought of hurting the dog in any way, and it was doubtful which of the two had the greater enjoyment of their mutual sport. Jack found a live dog infinitely more entertaining than his old toy upon its 4 wheels, and his great delight was to mount upon Dingo's back when the animal would gallop off with him like a race horse with its jockey. It must be owned that one result of this intimacy was a serious diminution of the supply of sugar in the store room. Dingo was the delight of all the crew excepting Negoro, who cautiously avoided coming in contact with an animal who showed such unmistakable symptoms of hostility. The new companions that Jack had thus found did not in the least make him forget his old friend Dick Sands, who devoted all his leisure time to him as assiduously as ever. Mrs. Weldon regarded the intimacy with the greatest satisfaction, and one day made a remark to that effect in the presence of Captain Hull. "You are right, madam," said the captain cordially. "Dick is a capital fellow, and will be sure to be a first-rate sailor. He has an instinct which is little short of a genius. It supplies all deficiencies of theory. Considering how short an experience and how little instruction he has had, it is quite wonderful how much he knows about a ship." "Certainly for his age," assented Mrs. Weldon. "He is singularly advanced. I can safely say that I have never had a fault to find with him. I believe that it is my husband's intention, after this voyage, to let him have systematic training in navigation, so that he may be able ultimately to become a captain." "I have no misgivings, madam," replied the captain. "There is every reason to expect that he will be an honour to the service." "Poor orphan," said the lady; "he has been trained in a hard school." "Its lessons have not been lost upon him," rejoined Captain Hull. "They have taught him the prime lesson, that he has his own way to make in the world." The eyes of the 2 speakers turned as it were unwittingly in the direction where Dick Sands happened to be standing. He was at the helm. "Look at him now," said the captain; "see how steadily he keeps his eye upon the fore. Nothing distracts him from his duty. He is as much to be depended on as the most experienced helmsman. It was a capital thing for him that he began his training as a cabin boy. Nothing like it. Begin at the beginning. It is the best way for training for the merchant service." "But surely," interposed Mrs. Weldon, "you would not deny that in the navy there have been many good officers who have never had the training of which you are speaking." "True, madam; but yet even some of the best of them have begun at the lowest step of the ladder. For instance, Lord Nelson." Just at this instant Cousin Benedict emerged from the stern cabin, and completely absorbed, according to his wont, in his own pursuit, began to wander up and down the deck, peering into the interstices of the network, rummaging under the seats, and drawing his long fingers along the cracks in the floor where the tar had crumbled away. "Well, Benedict, how are you getting on?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "Oh, well enough, thank you," he replied dreamily, "but I wish we were on shore." "What were you looking for under that bench?" said Captain Hull. "Insects, of course," answered Benedict. "I am always looking for insects." "But don't you know, Benedict," said Mrs. Weldon, "that Captain Hull is far too particular to allow any vermin on the deck of his vessel?" Captain Hull smiled and said, "Mrs. Weldon is very complimentary, but I am really inclined to hope that your investigations in the cabins of the 'Pilgrim' will not be attended with much success." Cousin Benedict shrugged his shoulders in a manner that indicated that he was aware that the cabins could furnish nothing attractive in the way of insects. "However," continued the captain, "I dare say down in the hold you could find some cockroaches, but cockroaches, I presume, would be of little or no interest to you." "No interest!" cried Benedict, at once warmed into enthusiasm; "why, are they not the very orthoptera that roused the imprecations of Virgil and Horace? Are they not closely allied to the Periplaneta orientalis and the American cacarlac, which inhabit—" "I should rather say infest," interrupted the captain. "Easy enough to see, sir," replied Benedict, stopping short with amazement, "that you are not an entomologist." "I fear I must plead guilty to your accusation," said the captain good humouredly. "You must not expect every one to be such an enthusiast in your favourite study as yourself," Mrs. Weldon interposed. "But are you not satisfied with the result of your explorations in New Zealand?" "Yes, yes," answered Benedict, with a sort of hesitating reluctance. "I must not say I was dissatisfied. I was really very delighted to secure that new staphylin, which hitherto had never been seen elsewhere than in New California. But still, you know, an entomologist is always craving for fresh additions to his collection." While he was speaking, Dingo, leaving little Jack, who was romping with him, came and jumped on Benedict and began to fawn on him. "Get away, you brute!" he exclaimed, thrusting the dog aside. "Poor Dingo! Good dog!" cried Jack, running up and taking the animal's huge head between his tiny hands. "Your interest in cockroaches, Mr. Benedict," observed the captain, "does not seem to extend to dogs." "It isn't that I dislike dogs at all," answered Benedict, "but this creature has disappointed me." "How do you mean? You could hardly want to catalogue him with the diptera or hymenoptera?" asked Mrs. Weldon laughingly. "Oh, not at all," replied Benedict, with the most unmoved gravity; "but I understood that he had been found on the west coast of Africa, and I hoped that perhaps he might have brought over some African hemiptera in his coat; but I have searched his coat well, over and over again, without finding a single specimen. The dog has disappointed me," he repeated mournfully. "I can only hope," said the captain, "that if you had found anything you were going to kill it instantly." Benedict looked with mute astonishment into the captain's face. In a moment or two afterwards he said, "I suppose, sir, you acknowledge that Sir John Franklin was an eminent member of your profession?" "Certainly; why?" "Because Sir John would never take away the life of the most insignificant insect. It is related of him that when he had once been incessantly tormented all day by a mosquito, at last he found it on the back of his hand, and blew it off, saying, 'Fly away, little creature; the world is large enough for both you and me.'" "That little anecdote of yours, Mr. Benedict," said the captain, smiling, "is a good deal older than Sir John Franklin. It is told, in nearly the same words, about Uncle Toby in Sterne's Tristram Shandy, only there it was not a mosquito, it was a common fly." "And was Uncle Toby an entomologist?" asked Benedict. "Did he ever really live?" "No," said the captain, "he was only a character in a novel." Cousin Benedict gave a look of utter contempt, and Captain Hull and Mrs. Weldon could not resist laughing. Such is only one instance of the way in which Cousin Benedict invariably brought it about that all conversation with him ultimately turned upon his favourite pursuit; and all along, throughout the monotonous hours of smooth sailing, while the "Pilgrim" was making her little headway to the east, he showed his own devotion to his pet science by seeking to enlist new disciples. First of all he tried his powers of persuasion upon Dick Sands; but soon finding that the young apprentice had no taste for entomological mysteries, he gave him up and turned his attention to the negroes. Nor was he much more successful with them. One after another, Tom, Bat, Actæon, and Austin had all withdrawn themselves from his instructions, and the class at last was reduced to the single person of Hercules; but in him the enthusiastic naturalist thought he had discovered a latent talent, which could distinguish between a parasite and a Thysanura. Hercules accordingly submitted to pass a considerable portion of his leisure in the observation of every variety of coleoptera. He was encouraged to study the extensive collection of stag beetles, tiger beetles, and lady birds; and although at times the enthusiast trembled to see some of his most delicate and fragile specimens in the huge grasp of his pupil, he soon learned that the man's gentle docility was a sufficient guarantee against his clumsiness. While the science of entomology was thus occupying its two votaries, Mrs. Weldon was giving her own best attention